This is session 2 of the Lenten study from the gate to the grave. As we begin our session today, I want to go back and review some things and just make some comments on some of the things we said. One of the things I wanted to mention to you that when we look at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we need to understand that the early church, those that Paul had written to, the people at Ephesus and Corinth and Rome and other places, they did not have a copy of a gospel. All they had were copies of the writings of Paul and what he had taught them while he was there. When you look at the history of the Gospels, Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, was recorded around 60 AD. This Gospel is thought to have been written from Rome, primarily because people were beginning to forget or mix up the stories of Jesus. And so Mark wanted to clarify and codex a set of stories that were to be told the same way every time. 20 years later, Matthew comes on the scene, and he writes the gospel for a different purpose. He uses the outline, many think, of Mark, and then he expands it. And not only does he expand it, he also creates within this numerous Old Testament quotes so that he could be telling Jewish people that Jesus is Messiah, and I'm proving it through the Old Testament. Luke writes his gospel around 85, and some scholars believe that Luke himself saw the gospel of Mark and the gospel of Matthew, and then basically said, I can do a better story. He writes it from a Gentile perspective, and he adds to that the book of Acts to tell a complete story from the birth of Jesus to the birth of the church. The Gospel of John works different. It is a theological treatise. The writing of our book of John did not start until about 90 AD, but what we have in our Bibles was not completed until after 100. Some say as late as 150. It wasn't until the Council of Carthage in 397 that the text, the 27 books that make up our New Testament, were put together so that we could have, in essence, the Second Testament or the New Testament. The other thing is, I had mentioned about how Mark and Luke tell stories, and Matthew always wants to be grander by doubling the numbers. Here's a list of some of those. In the Gadarene demoniac story, Luke and Mark have one person. In Matthew, he has two demoniacs. On the road, Jesus healed one on the road. In Matthew, he healed two blind men on the road. When he fed 5,000 and also the 4,000. Mark and Matthew had 5,000. Mark and Luke had 5,000 men and 4,000 men. Matthew had 5,000 men plus women and children. And also, when Jesus was returning from Tyre and Sidon, it said great crowds gathered around, but in Mark it says just a single deaf man. In Matthew 18, we're supposed to come like children, plural, where in Mark and Luke it's just a child. And then I think we spoke last week about how Jesus was beginning to enter into Jerusalem, and he came in on a colt, but in Matthew, it was a colt with a donkey. So at the last session, we had Jesus mounted on a donkey coming into the city of Jerusalem, being proclaimed Messiah. This is a copy of what is now termed the city of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus' life. You see that at the top here, that you have the old city or the lower city. Herod has taken this and greatly expanded this. Herod, in his reign, made the city much, much larger. He expanded the temple. He added the fortress. Antonia and Herod's citadel. It is a much larger city and a heavier fortified city. He also asked permission to rebuild the temple itself. After Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, when they came back, Nehemiah's temple was about the size of the Old Testament tabernacle. He wanted to build this grander and larger, and got permission from the priest to do that as long as they would not interfere with the sacrifices. The work began around 19 BC and was still in progress when Jesus uh, entered that space. Uh, this is a close up of the court itself, of what it would have looked like in Jesus' day. Most people would enter here at the temple entrance. You have a bath or a cleansing pool. When people came into the temple, they wanted to be sure they were clean. We would all call this a baptismal font. They would come in and they would wash themselves and then enter the temple clean. They would go up these steps and through these doors, and it was almost like a tunnel event. You went down from the bottom and then up a level into the actual courtyard of the temple itself. It is now a very large complex, 600 feet by 900 feet. The walls would stand 16 feet around. So when you came up these steps, the first place you would come to here is the court of the Gentiles. Anyone could come into the court of the Gentiles, whether you were Jewish or Roman or anybody else. Uh, they said that this was a place where they would gather to hear teachings. Those who wanted to become Jewish or interested about Jewish religion could come here. But it also uh, looked more like a place of a county fair, because not only did you have all these mixed peoples coming here, this is also where they would buy and exchange uh, their goods. If a person came from a great distance away, they may not have the ability to bring a lamb into Jerusalem, but they could come here in the courtyard and they could buy a certified sacrifice. Uh, if they needed to pay their temple tax, they didn't want to pay it with dirty Roman money. They wanted to pay it with temple money, and it was there that they would exchange it. Uh, the area was open to anybody, proselytes, interested persons. Uh, but then the rules changed as you went deeper. When you went into the temple proper, there were 10 gates around leading into the temple itself. And at each one of those entrances, there was a plaque that Herod had posted as a warning. No foreigner shall enter the forecourt or the balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death. So then the next level uh, is the women's court. And in this part of the temple, any Jewish person could come, man, woman, child. Uh, it is here that those that were healed of leprosy came to show themselves to the priest and be declared clean. It's here that when people did a Nazarite vow for a period of time, would come to have get a haircut, and would be brought back into the community. Um, just beyond this is the court of the Israelites, and this is where Jewish men could go and would carry their sacrifices. It was a very narrow strip. It was basically a station of observation where they would hand their sacrifices over to the priest in this inner court called the court of the Israelites. And the court of priests, they would take it, slaughter the animal, they would make the sacrifice, and no one was allowed there except the priests. In the center of this was the temple proper. Uh, And here, very much like the Solomon's temple, as you went into the holy place, you had three primary appointments. You had the lampstand with the burning candles. You had the table of showbread, 12 loaves for the tribe, and the altar of incense. The rising smoke carries the prayers up to God. But behind this was a massive curtain, and behind the curtain was the Holy of Holies. This is where you had the Ark of the Covenant that had been carted around in David's time. But behind this massive curtain now is nothing but a rock. The dome of the rock that we know it in Jerusalem now. It's the same place that uh, Abraham is said to have sacrificed or was going to sacrifice his son on. It's this rock that's there that is where they think that maybe Jacob spent the night and had that dream of the angels going up and down the stairway and he declaring it the gate of heaven. It is the center of the world for those people, this solitary stone. So now we enter uh, the section that of the text itself. I'll get it out in a minute. The stories of Mark and Matthew and Luke. Sometimes they tell the stories very similarly, sometimes they're very different. In Matthew, when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." And then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and he overturned the temple tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves." Mark says basically the same thing. Uh, Luke does. He entered and drove out those who were selling things. In Matthew, though, he talks about how the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them at this same time. Uh, Now, the turning over the temple money, the money changers, and driving out of those selling animals, it is not the task that's wrong; it's how the task was being carried out. They had to buy those animals to make sure that they was a right, clean animal. They had to exchange that money because they wanted the clean temple money to be paid into the temple. The problem was that Jesus realized that they were taking a necessity of the people to benefit the people and had turned it into a very profitable business. At times, they would overcharge many times the price of something, and so they would become rich. So it wasn't the dove or the money, it was the profit that was the issue. In Matthew, the priest came out and the scribes said they heard the children crying in the temple itself, "Hosanna, son of David," and they became angry. And they said, "Do you not hear what these children are saying?" And Jesus said, "Well, have you never read that out of the mouths of babes and infants you shall be praised?" And so he left them and went to the city of Bethany and spent the night there. This is where Jesus had raised Lazarus, and he stayed in that home. Mark, though, has a different tale. He entered Jerusalem and went to the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, because it was late in the day, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Then you come to Monday morning. In Matthew, in the morning he returned to the city, and seeing a fig tree by the side of the road. He went to it and found nothing, nothing but leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And at once the fig tree withered, and his disciples were amazed. Mark puts a little twist on it. Seeing a fig tree at a distance, he goes over and finds nothing but leaves and just curses it. May no one ever eat of your fruit again. And it puzzled the disciples. Why curse a tree for not having fruit when it's not time for the fruit to be on the tree? Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to this fig tree, but if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. For whatever you ask for in prayer, you will receive. After the questioning part of Mark, that's when Jesus finally enters the temple and turns over the money changers' tables and throws them out. Um, the chief priests and the scribes heard all about it, and they were looking for a way now to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound. And so, after teaching in the temple, when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out. On Tuesday, in the morning, according to Mark, in the morning, they passed by and they saw that fig tree he had cursed, and it had withered away to its roots. Peter said, look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed is withered and gone. And Jesus said, have faith. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe as though you have already received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. And if you have anything against anyone, forgive them, so that when you go to your Father, he may also forgive you. And so Jesus is now in Jerusalem again. And he was walking in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, these leaders, were all following him around. They said, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? Jesus said, let me ask you a question. And if you answer the question, then I will tell you by whose authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it from human origin? They argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, then why didn't you believe? But if we say of human origin, he will say, they were afraid of the crowd because all the people regarded John as a prophet. So they came back to Jesus and they said, we don't know. And Jesus said, well, neither will I tell you what authority that I'm doing these things. As we see over and over and over again as Jesus is in the temple, uh, they are trying to trick him. They are trying to discredit Jesus in front of the people so they would lose their interest in him. And so then he begins to teach some parables. What do you think he said? A man had two sons and went to the first one and said, son, go and work in the vineyard today. And the son said, I will not. but then later changed his mind and he went. The father came to the second son and said to go into the field. And he said, well, I'll go. But he never went. And so Jesus asked him, which of the two did the will of his father? They said, the first. And Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in a way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes believed in him. Even after you saw it, you did not change your mind. And so then Jesus moves back to another parable in Mark. He began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. And he leased it to these tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away. So he sends another, and they beat this one, hit him over the head and insulted him. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. They beat some they killed. But finally it came where he had one beloved son. And he sent him, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, we'll kill him, and then the inheritance will belong to us. So they seized him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And this was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. And when they realized that he told this parable against them, he wanted to arrest him. You have to look at that section about sending many and then coming back. The servants that the owner kept sending were representing the prophets who God sent over and over and over again, and who were most often over and over again rejected. And then he sends his only or his last son, and they rejected him as well. Jesus had his way of exposing those who wanted to trap him. He tells the same parable in Matthew. Therefore, the stone the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people that produce the fruits of the kingdom. He's basically saying that Israel will lose its right, and those outside of Israel, the Gentiles, will pick up the torch. When the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they were realizing he was speaking about them, and they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. And then there's the parable of the wedding banquet, found only in Matthew. And when you look at this, as with all parables, you need to understand that parables are fictitious stories with a point to be made. We're in school, we read Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, and those stories. Uh, they are fictional stories, but at the end, they tell us a truth. And that's what Jesus does with parables. The parables are not actual stories. They are made up stories, example stories. And from those example stories, we are to learn a lesson. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in the parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call to those who had been invited to the wedding, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who've been invited, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatted calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding.'" Dr. Evelyn Laycock, who years and years taught at Hiawassee College, had done research, and she said you knew how big the party was by what they served. If it was a small party, like 2 to 4 people, they would probably serve a big chicken. If it was 5 to 8, a large duck. If you had 9 to 15 people, a kid or a small goat. 16 to 35, a full-grown lamb. But beyond that, the fatted calf, the ox. This is going to be a big party. But they all made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the slaves and mistreated them and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops to destroy those murderers and burn their cities, and said to the slaves, "The wedding is ready, so invite those who were not worthy. Go to the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding feast." And those slaves went out to the streets and gathered whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. And then we have this strange little twist of things. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed there was a man who was not wearing a wedding robe. A wedding robe? You're going out into the streets and to the slums and everywhere else, bringing all these people in, good and bad. Where do they get wedding robes? Did they pass them out the door as they came in? We don't know. But one was standing there without the robe. And so he says to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." And that is a reoccurring theme through the Gospels, being cast out into darkness, into sadness, and in pain. The questions continue. Then they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him to see what he would say. Herodians were Jewish people who had bought into the Roman way of life. They accepted Roman rule. They had accepted the Roman culture itself. Uh, the Pharisees, we understand, are that party that uh, is a teaching party that many seem similar to Jesus' teaching. They believe in angels and demons and an afterlife. So they sent them there to ask the question. And they came and said, "Teacher, we know you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach people the way of God in accordance to the truth." Socrates, uh, years before, he's the one who said an unexamined life is not worth living. had in part of his philosophy something called ironic modesty. Oh, sure, I'm smart and I understand that, but no one's as smart as you are. So you kind of downplay it. And so that's what they say. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said, putting me to the test, bring me a denarius and let me see it. And so they brought one. And he said, whose head and title is on this coin? And they answered, the emperor's. And so Jesus says, give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and to God the things that are God's. And they were utterly amazed. Because the twist is Caesar owns some things, and you have to pay Caesar those some things that you owe. But God owns it all. So again, some Sadducees who say there was no resurrection uh, came and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies leaving a wife but no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up the children for his brother. There were 7 brothers, they said. And the first one married and he died and left no children. And so the second married her and died, leaving no children. And the third did likewise. None of the 7 left children. Now, call me suspicious, but if there were 7 brothers and I was number 7, and 5 or 6 had died with this woman before, I would have had my doubts about marrying her, no matter what the law said. But they said, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And that is an Old Testament law. Uh, it's an inheritance law. It happened to Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, who was supposed to have gotten a younger son. The story there it was that if the older son, who was to receive the inheritance and pass things on, died without a child, his wife got another one of the brothers, and the first male child that she bore would be treated as the older son's son. So you have this lady who's had 7 husbands and no children. Jesus said, is not this the reason that you are wrong? Do you not know the scriptures or the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. Oh, that brings up a question. When we die, do we become angels and we all look alike and act alike and just do the will of God? When we make this transition from our body here into that angelic body, will we recognize others? Will we know our family? It's a hard question. And he said, and as for being raised from the dead, have you not read the book of Moses? In the story about the bush, how God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but the living. You are wrong. So Jesus corrects their theology of what the afterlife might be like. And so then they come and ask another question. Continuing in Mark. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing one another, and seeing that he had answered them well, and asked him, which commandment is the first of all? And Jesus answered, the first is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Which is not a part of the Ten Commandments, but it is a commandment. It's called the Shema, found in Deuteronomy 6:4. And then he adds to that, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other greater commandment than these. Jesus had done a remarkable thing. He had taken what was once just considered 10 laws, the 10 commandments, and then had taken all those laws in Leviticus that stretched it out to where the Jewish people eventually said there were 613 commandments, and he condensed it all into 2. Love God and love your neighbor. There is no greater commandment than these. Then the scribe said to him, you're right, teacher, and you have truly said that he is one, and besides him there's no other. And to love him with all your heart and with all your understanding, with all your strength, to love one's neighbor as yourself. This is much more important than all the burnt offerings. Then Jesus saw that he answered wisely and said, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him a question. Now, in Matthew, to conclude this, now while the Pharisees were gathered, Jesus asked him this question. What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? They said, the son of David. And he said to them, then how is it then that David, by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, the Lord is my Lord. Sit at my right hand. I will put your enemies under your feet. If David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? And no one was able to answer him, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any other questions. The Lord, of course, in this story he was asking, the first Lord is God. The second is the Messiah. You find this in Psalm 110:1. The Lord in all capital letters, Yahweh, and Lord in smaller case letters. Next week, we'll continue with our third session, going into chapters 23 through 26 in Matthew, Mark chapters 12 through 14, and Luke chapters 20 through 22.